as a Jewish tribe. So definitely, no question, right? And we know the Quran affirms this, that every single prophet that came before the Prophet ﷺ always mentioned two messages. One, La ilaha illallah, and Muhammad Rasulullah. They also told of Muhammad ﷺ coming. The Prophet Jesus mentions in the Quran, وَمُبَشِّرٌ بِرَسُولٍ يَأْتِي مِن بَعْدِهِ اسْمُهُ أَحْمَدُ, as we said before. So this was definitely in the sacred scriptures other than the Quran. Why are we saying all this? Because when the Prophet ﷺ gets to Syria and his uncle sends him back, why did he send him back? Right? Because he runs into one of the Christian monks, right? And he sees the Prophet ﷺ, he sees signs, he sees ayat, he sees the clouds that follow him, that move with him, he sees how nature reacts to him as he walks by. He sees these things, right? And he asks Abu Talib, who's this? And then Abu Talib said, it's my son. And then the monk says back, that's not your son. Why? Because he knows one of the signs is that he's an orphan. He says, that can't be your son. He said, okay, he's my nephew. And then he says, take him back. Don't let him come here again, because the Jewish tribes that are there, they might do something damaging to him. Right? People have hasad, people have envy. You don't know what can happen, because they can read the signs just like I can. And when they find out he's an Arab, and he's not from Bani Israel, then you might have some amongst them who, will treat him with envy. So he didn't mean all of them, right? Because there were people of the Jewish tribes who did become Muslim. It's not like all of them. One of the wives of the Prophet ﷺ was one of them. Sittina Safiyya bint Huyay, she was formerly of a Jew, and she became Muslim. So he didn't mean all of them, but he said there are elements amongst them, right, that could be harmful to the Prophet ﷺ. So he said, take him back. Don't bring him back here again, right? Because here in Syria, you have people who read scripture. So the impression I'm left with is that there were a lot of people who were aware and anticipating the coming of this final Prophet ﷺ. Something that was kind of well known. It wasn't like some secret, right? Except to the people of Mecca. They were idolaters. They didn't read scripture. They didn't even read. They didn't have Bible. They didn't have Torah. They didn't have anything. So these were some of the elements that were happening. So he said, فَرَدَّهُ خَوْفًا مِنَ الْيَهُودِ عَلَيْهِ أَهْلِ الْمَكْرِ وَالْجُحُودِ. His uncle sent him back out of fear of the Yahud, some being devious and disbelieving folk. So the Prophet ﷺ, 13, he goes back, and he grows up to be a young man. Now he's about 24, 25. What happened between 13 and 24, 25? Our assumption is that he remained in Mecca, and he probably, because he didn't go back to Syria after that, and one narration mentions he did go to Yemen with his uncle, perhaps. But outside of this, we know that he would help his uncle in his tijara, his commercial business, but not traveling with him. Until he becomes 24 or 25, and then he becomes well known for his honesty, right? So probably he had many dealings with people in Mecca on behalf of his uncle, and people know that he was an honest person, he was a trustworthy person, he wouldn't rip you off, he would only say the truth. And so his reputation began to grow as this type of trustworthy person. So this caught the attention of whom? Khadija bint Khuwaylid. Right? Khadija bint Khuwaylid is one of the senior ladies of Mecca. She is probably one of the few who has her own tijara, has her own business. So she, like Abu Talib, is a trader, but she was much more successful than probably Abu Talib was. And she would have people, men who would trade on her behalf. And the way that it was done back then, she would say, take this, these wares, this merchandise over there, and you'll get X%, or you get this much, right? Well, I'll give you 2 camels. Back then it wasn't so much gold and silver, but it was, what are the things that you'll get in return. So the Prophet's honesty and so forth got the attention of Khadija bint Khuwaylid. And he went with one of the servants of Khadija. His name was Maysara, which is the next line. So it says here, وَعَدَ مَعَ مَيْسَرَةٍ لِلشَّامِ وَهُوَ مِنَ الرَّحْمَنِ فِي إِكْرَامٍ. He later returned to Syria with Maysara, all the while in the bounty of the Merciful. Now Maysara is young, but he's also intelligent. And he also sees these things happening on the trip. He sees like rocks like turning over when he walks by, and it seems like they're communicating with the Prophet ﷺ, and other things that he can't explain. And he sees clouds that travel with him. It's as if he sees angels hovering above him. He sees all these things while they're happening with the Prophet ﷺ. So he gets back to Mecca and he tells Khadija of what he found, of what he saw in the Prophet ﷺ, and actually how he actually was very good at what he did too. He made her business very profitable. People liked to deal with him. And so that was something else that happened during the trip. So he mentions here, طُلُّهُ الْأَمْلَاكُ فِي الْمَسِيرِ حِينَ اشْتِدَادِ الْحَرِّ فِي الْهَجِيرِ. The angels shaded him during the trip from the worst of the heat at midday. This was during the trip as they're traveling to Syria from Mecca. So he returns to Mecca. وَإِذْ إِلَى مَكَّةَ عَادَ وَافْتَتَحَ 26 مِنَ الْعُمْرِ نَكَحَ. When he returned to Mecca at the outset of his 26th year, he entered into marriage with Sayyidina Khadija. How exactly did it happen? There's several different narrations. One of them being that Khadija is the one who sent for him, from what she learned of the Prophet's piety and his honesty and trustworthiness. And so she communicated this to some of her male relatives, who then went to ask the Prophet ﷺ if he'd be interested in marrying Khadija. That's one narration. Another narration is that Abu Talib himself went to Khadija and negotiated the marriage, whatever the case may be. They married at that particular time. Khadija was twice widowed before this, and she had 2 children from previous marriages. One of them was Hind ibn Abi Hala, and Abu Hala was her first husband, and Hind was the son. He is also the person who is called Al-Wassaf. Sayyidina Al-Hasan narrates a hadith in the Shama'il al-Tirmidhi where he says, I asked my uncle. Who's he talking about? He's talking about the young man who was raised in the household of the Prophet ﷺ, because it was the son of Khadija. Though it's not the Prophet's son, he treated him like a son. So he said he was like my uncle. So he said, I asked my uncle, describe to me the Prophet ﷺ. Right? Because the Hassan and Hussein, who were the grandchildren of the Prophet ﷺ, were very young when the Prophet ﷺ died. Maybe they were toddlers, 3, 4, 5 years of age. So they wanted to know about him. So the best description, physical description that we find in the narration of the hadith was by whom? By the son of Khadija, who was the Rabib, or who was the young man who lived in the household of the Prophet ﷺ. So the Prophet ﷺ had a few young men who lived in his household. Hind Abu Hala was one. Who was the other? Later on. No. Yes, that's true. Bilal as well, but someone of his family. Sayyidina Ali ibn Abi Talib, right, later on when the Prophet ﷺ is married, and in terms of business they're doing well, and Sayyidina Ali went to live with, or stay with the Prophet ﷺ, because Abu Talib was getting older and he wasn't, doing commercial trading that he was doing before when he was a younger man. And Sayyidina Ja'far went to Sayyidina Hamza, stayed with him. So they get back to Mecca, they get married, and Sayyidina Khadija was already 40 years of age. Khadija min ba'di 40 مضت لها من عمرها سنين. This is the popular narration, that she was 40 years of age. There's another weaker narration that said she was 28. Whatever the case may be, the 40-year narration is the more popular one. And despite her being 40 years of age, she still bore 4 daughters to the Prophet ﷺ, right? Ruqayya and Zainab and Kulthum and Fatima. خير نساء الناس أجمعين وقد أقامت معه 20. The best of women, all of them, she resided him for 24 years, and all of his children he was granted from her except one with certainty. وأربع ورزق البنين منها سوى أحدهم يقينا. So there's only one child that was not born from Khadija, who was Ibrahim, who was the son of Maria Qibtiyya, or Maria the Copt, who he had received from al-Muqawqis, or the leader of Coptic Egypt, and she was sent to him to be his bride, Sayyidina Maria. So he had one son, Ibrahim. There's other narrations that he had other sons from Khadija, but they all died in their infancy. But the one that we know for certain is Ibrahim, who died around 2 years of age, and the 4 daughters were the ones who remained and lived. So, Khairun Nisa, the best of women. Why? Some of the hadith mentioned this, right? The Prophet ﷺ said in one of the hadith, كَمِلُوا مِنَ الرِّجَالِ كَثِيرٌ. Many of the men have reached this state of completion and perfection. وَكَمِلُوا مِنَ النِّسَاءِ أَرْبَعَةٌ. But 4 amongst the women in particular, and he mentions Khadija, his wife, Fatima, his daughter, and the other 2 were Maryam bint Imran, Mary, the mother of Jesus and the daughter of Imran, and Sayyidina Asya. Who's Asya? Wife of Pharaoh, right? And if you study those 4 women in particular, you will find that they're archetypes, right? They're particular types of women. Sayyidina Asya, in our modern language, we would say that she was a victim of domestic abuse, right? Who was one of the worst men to ever live? Pharaoh, Fir'aun, right? And she wouldn't say to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, "Najini min Fir'aun wa amali." Save me from Fir'aun and his deeds, what he does. He was a despicable man. But that was the wife, and even she's in that position, right? And she could choose to be in the loftiest of positions, right? She can choose to, give Pharaoh what he wants, and she's the queen. She could be the Nefertiti. But she didn't choose that, right? She chose Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So it was Asya, right? And she was also instrumental in taking care of whom? Musa alayhi salam, right? Who actually raised him? She did, right? Moses was raised in the household of Pharaoh. So similarly, she raised a man who later was a prophet, right? And that's Sayyidina Asya. If you look at Maryam, right off the bat, when she has a baby and it seems like there's no father, not seems like there was no father, what did her people say to her when she brought the baby, holding him like this? لَقَدْ جِئْتِ شَيْئًا فَرِيًّا مَا كَانَ أَبُوكِ امْرَأَ سَوْءٍ وَمَا كَانَتْ أُمُّكِ بَغِيًّا. You have brought such a shame upon us, such a great, immense disservice. شَيْئًا فَرِيًّا, what is this that you've done? They couldn't fathom, what is that? Right? Maryam was the one who her mother, right, when the baby was still in the womb, she said, "I'm dedicating this baby in my womb to the service of the temple." Assuming it was going to be a son, right? She said, "I want him to be completely in the service of the temple." But then it was a girl. So what happened? She goes, "Oh, it's a girl. Girls don't go to the temple," right? It's kind of very patriarchal and it's not for women. It's not what happened. She actually went to the temple and served the temple, right? So she kind of broke a mold that nobody was doing back then. And at the same time, she stayed in the temple and she was a servant of the temple. There was only one man who had a key to go up to her room, who was Zechariah, right? And Zechariah, he's the one, when they drew the straws, his straw came up. And he's also the father of Yahya, right? You gotta know this stuff. So Yahya and Isa lived during the same time. And in fact, they occupy the same heaven in the heavens, because we know during the Isra and Mi'raj that the Prophet ﷺ found them, I think, in the 4th heaven, and it was Jesus and Yahya, Jesus and John. So Zechariah is the only one who has a key to go up there. So he goes up one time and he finds summer fruit during winter. So like summer, and it wasn't because of ShopRite, right? They didn't have that back then. So there's no way you could have watermelon in the winter, right? You couldn't have plums and peaches and nectarines and these things in the winter. And likewise, he found winter fruit during the summer. So oranges and citrus and lemons, he finds it in the summer. And then he said, "Where did you get this from?" "Anna laki hadha." Anna means how, where, how did this happen? And I'm the one who comes up there. Who brought it to you? And where would it come from? And we're out here and there's nothing like that, right? She said, "Oh, min indillah." It's from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So she served the temple, and then a man comes to her in that room, right? And she didn't know where he came from. She knows that Zechariah is the one who has the key, But somehow he appeared, right? And appears right in front of her. What was the first thing she said? Inni a'udhu birrahmani minka in kunta taqiyya. Right? I seek refuge. She didn't know what he was there for. I seek refuge with Allah from you if you are a person of taqwa. But who was this man? It wasn't a man. It was Jibreel, alayhi salam. And he came to tell her of the miraculous birth that she was about to have. Right? And it was overwhelming. Overwhelming, right? She said, I wish I was Nasiyan Mansiya. Right? I wish I was something that was forgotten and never been to begin with. But she overcame this, right? And she became Maryam, the mother of Isa. The only woman mentioned in the Quran by name is who? Maryam. No other woman is mentioned by name. It's always Imra'at al-Aziz. Even Asya is not mentioned by name. It's Imra'at Fir'aun, the wife of Pharaoh. So the only one mentioned by name is Maryam, alayhi salam. And she is the only one that even some of the ulama believe she might have been a prophet herself. Because Jibreel spoke to her directly. And an angel normally will only speak to someone in that way and tell them of something about to happen. We call that wahi. We call that revelation. So if you can see an angel and he speaks to you at the same time, that means you're a prophet. Generally, that's the definition. So some of them said that by virtue of this connection she had with Jibreel, that she was a prophet. Most of them said no, because the Quran, there's another verse that's clear that says that the prophets were rijal, were men. But some of them said, in this particular case, there was some type of prophecy for, whatever the case may be. Maryam at least was a siddiqa. Right? She was someone who was of a caliber of the highest form, as close as you could get to being a prophet. But she was, in our common language today, we call her a single mom. Right? She didn't have a husband to help her raise this young man who's later going to be a prophet. Just like Asya was raising this young man, Musa, in a household of a tyrant, a despot. And then we get to Fatima and Khadija, right? So we have one who's a victim of domestic abuse. We have one who is a single mother. What about Khadija? Twice widowed, right? Most people don't associate like someone who's twice widowed as someone, so this is her third marriage. But despite being her third marriage and going through more than one marriage, she is still considered to be amongst, or the greatest woman who had ever lived, and the greatest woman of paradise. And then Fatima, the daughter of the Prophet ﷺ, her nickname was Ummu Abiha, the mother of her father, right? Because that's how she was, right? Men, if you're lucky, if you ever have a daughter who's kind of the one who's always doting on you and making sure that everything's taken care of for you and stuff like that, that was the type of daughter that Fatima was, Ummu Abiha. Right? When the Prophet ﷺ was praying in the Kaaba in Mecca still, and he was in sujood, and there's despicable people bring camel entrails and they throw it on the back of the Prophet ﷺ. Who was the one who ran out and cleaned it off his back? Fatima. Right? She was a young girl, maybe 8, 9 years old. And she sees that, right? And she runs out and clears it off his back. So all of them had very special things about them, right? That I think anyone, man or woman, can find within them something that they can try to emulate for themselves. So what time is it? Oh, it's past 7. So let's just finish this section. ثم ابن 35 حضر بناء بيت الله إذ بنى الحجر. When he was 35 years of age, he witnessed the restoration of the Kaaba, and he himself